So we were in the area. Yeah. Like you're like we used to go to all of these. They'd have those downstairs. I would just go for that. No, we're the other round.
Good morning, everybody. My name is John Hazen White, and I want to welcome everybody. It's so great to be able to be back in person, and there's also a large number of people watching virtually. So thank you for taking the time out of your day. Daryl West and I put our heads together on this manufacturing activity years ago. This is the 11th forum of its type, 11th year. And the purpose was to sort of think about manufacturing and where it stood in America. Would it come back at some point the way we knew it historically? Such a valuable part of the American society dream, development and building of wealth for everybody. And so we wanted to begin to explore that, and we have over the years. As I think about it, though, I was kind of just thinking about this now, or yesterday also. Over time, there became sort of an attitude that the United States had acquiesced its manufacturing position to other countries for cost reasons and et cetera. And we were becoming more of a service-oriented country. And I really never bought into that. But I think I can stand here and say that if there ever was a time to think about manufacturing in America and the value of it, it's now. The value of the investment in manufacturing is proven in the last 2.5 years. Because as I think about it, I talk about the frontline workers and the hospital workers and police, fire, et cetera, EMTs as heroes. I also consider, from the bottom of my heart, the people that have built things for the last 2.5 years, have gotten out of bed every day and gone to work and put their lives on the line, have achieved the status of heroes. They are wonderful, and manufacturing has come to the front to really, in my opinion, help save this country through this pandemic, because we've continued to produce and to supply the needs for all of us to live. So this is a great opportunity, Daryl, to continue that dialogue and that sort of thought process, and I'm just so glad that so many people want to be a part of that. So thank you for coming, and I hope this is a valuable day, and it's great to be here with my family, and Liz and Ben, and John can't be here till later, but these two wonderful little babies. This is the 5th generation of this company, and they're letting us all know that, and they continue to. They're very special. So anyway, sorry, I love them so much. But anyway, it's just great to be here and to share with all of you. And Cheryl Merchant is my CEO of my company, and I have such good friends here. Thank you for taking part. Have a wonderful morning.
I'm here.
Okay, well, thank you, Johnny, and thank you, the 5th generation of the White family who is joining us today. That is certainly a historic moment. So I do want to thank Johnny and Liz, their sons John and Ben, and the extended families for your generous support of this forum, as well as our global manufacturing initiative, which has been going on at Brookings for a number of years. Johnny is a trustee, and we appreciate all that he has done to support our independent work at the institution. We're very grateful for your help. It is hard to believe this is the 11th annual John Hazen White Forum, but it has been an amazing series over the years. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Daryl West, Vice President of Government Studies here at Brookings. I'd like to welcome you to this event. We are webcasting the event live, so we appreciate all the people from around the country and around the world who are tuning in. We also are going to be archiving this video on the Brookings YouTube channel, so anybody who wants to tune in later will have an opportunity to do that. And we've set up a Twitter feed at #supplychain, so if you'd like to post any comments or questions during the event, please do so. So as Johnny mentioned, for more than a decade, we have explored different aspects of manufacturing, both in the United States as well as around the world. We've looked at the manufacturing renaissance and what has helped to bring that sector back. We've looked at various problems facing manufacturing and ways to overcome them. And we've examined what Presidents Obama, Trump, and Biden have done to encourage innovation and create jobs in this area. Today, we're going to look specifically at the issue of global supply chains, which we all know is an enormous set of problems. It's on the front page virtually every day now. There are many challenges. At Brookings, we actually published a paper this week entitled 6 Ways to Improve Global Supply Chains that is free and available online at brookings.edu. And in it, we focus on issues related to production, distribution, logistics, competition policy, and geopolitics, all of which are part of the supply chain issue. We make a number of recommendations in terms of bringing critical mission jobs back to the United States or nearby allies, just to help avoid the complicated geopolitics that has arisen in China, Europe, India, and elsewhere. We talk about steps to improve logistics in terms of shipping and cargo transportation in particular, the need to prioritize public health, especially as we hopefully are coming out of the pandemic so that companies have the workers they need to make and distribute products, manage the labor shortages, which many companies are experiencing now that we have a 3.6% national unemployment rate, and then fighting anti-competitive practices that have arisen in many sectors. To help us think about these issues, we have 3 distinguished experts. The Honorable David Cicilline is a member of Congress from Rhode Island. He was elected to Congress in 2010, and there he works on issues related to manufacturing, workforce development, and competition policy, among other issues. He has introduced the Make It in America legislation to retrain American workers and other bills to protect consumers and encourage greater competition in the marketplace. But perhaps most importantly, he's the author of a forthcoming book. I think it's entitled House on Fire, that is out at the end of August. And I'm told by the author, of course, that it is a great read, and I encourage all of you to pre-order it at your favorite bookstore. And I should mention he has to leave around 9:30 to get back to Judiciary Committee business on Capitol Hill. So if he leaves suddenly, it's not something that I or the other panelists said. David Dollar is a senior fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings. He's written extensively on trade, supply chains, and international affairs. In addition to his writing, he hosts a very popular Brookings website called Dollar and Cents, which I recommend highly to you. It's a really good conversation with him and the various guests that he has on. And then Leslie Tato is Executive Vice President of Business Operations at Taco Comfort Solutions. In that position, she handles production, logistics, and distribution, and therefore has extensive experience on supply chain issues. So, Leslie, I'm going to start with you.
Okay.
First of all, welcome to Brookings, and I know you are on the front lines of the supply chain issues. So what problems have you encountered, and what are you finding to be the most serious roadblocks?
Well, there are several challenges right now in the supply chain. I guess probably the biggest challenge that we're facing is making sure that we're getting materials that we need to make our products on time and to meet our customer expectations. We're finding massive delays. What we would find before about getting product delivered on time is taking 3 to 6 months longer sometimes. We're finding that our suppliers are having raw material challenges, so they're not finding component parts to incorporate into our parts. There are substantial increases in the cost of those raw materials, so we're trying to mitigate those costs. It's not so easy just to pass that along to your customer. We're finding components that at one time would cost us 53 cents can now be on the market for $50. So we're having to source from different places. We're finding huge increases in transportation. Our transportation's up about 137%. So on top of all of that, we're trying to incorporate that in and still trying to find workers who want to take those jobs. We're fortunate at TACO that we have I would say, one of the best workforces in the world. They're dedicated. They've been there throughout the duration. But now that we're starting to have people who find other opportunities or looking at retirement, trying to get folks in to make those products, all of those compound, right? And then you have to make sure that you're holding enough inventory so that when the orders come in, and we have orders, we have a backlog of orders, we're holding additional inventory just in case, right? So that's adding the financial costs of doing business right now. We're doing a really great job, I think, of seeing our way through, but it's a different challenge every day. I think one of the bigger challenges, too, in the supply chain is I call it whack-a-mole. I can find this component today and think it's readily available for the next order, and then now that component is not available. And when I can find that, now another component's not available. So there's a bit of that whack-a-mole that's happening that we're trying to, we do it every day. We're trying to make sure that we can still satisfy our customer demand.
So to summarize, basically, almost everything is a problem, it sounds like, and very expensive.
Well, let's just put it this way. When this all started, my hair was brown. So just a little bit of a challenge, but we're good.
That's like the line I used to use before I came to D.C. and dealt with all the humidity. My hair was straight. David,
Yes.
So you have worked extensively on manufacturing over the years, both when you were mayor of Providence and then now as a member of Congress. What are you doing to address some of these supply chain problems, and what do you think we should be doing?
Well, thank you again for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's great to see the wonderful White family. And I think Johnny's comments are really important to start with. That I think this moment in particular is a moment to sort of underscore what we've been talking about for a long time, about the importance of American manufacturing. And I think the supply chain issues that are present today are a reminder of why it makes a difference that we make things here in America, that we invest in research and innovation so that we can continue to develop new products and services, and that we have a competitive market because competition is the single greatest driver of innovation, and we want to out-innovate our competitors around the world. So this is a moment of tremendous challenge and incredible urgency, but I think also a lot of opportunity. So I think one of the things that you, Professor West, brilliantly wrote about in the Brookings piece you just released is, some of this is obviously a direct consequence of a once-in-a-generation pandemic, the just incredible disruption of our economy. And so, Congress has been very focused on doing all we can to defeat this pandemic and get through this public health crisis, because otherwise this is going to be a recurring problem. So that's really important. The second thing is we have to, I think, and we have done this in a number of different ways, continue to create more opportunities for American manufacturing, making certain that in sectors where we don't have manufacturing, that we devote resources to develop those parts of our economy so that we can have more and more things made in this country, so we have less reliance on transporting things from other places, particularly in the complicated geopolitical world we currently live in. And so I think that, but I think most importantly for the supply chain issue is we basically didn't have a very sophisticated way of monitoring, protecting, and building supply chain resiliency. We sort of relied on the marketplace to do it. And I think we didn't have, until the Competes Act, even a plan to create an office within the Department of Commerce to really focus on supply chain resiliency and to be sure that we have a monitoring system so we're alerted when there are going to be challenges to critical parts of the supply chain. So the Competes Act, which we passed in the House, the Senate passed a different version. The House version is much better, obviously. But it invests $52 billion to create the Chips for America Fund to really help ensure that we can make more semiconductors here in the United States, which is absolutely critical, not only to our economic future, but to the national security of our country. It also makes tremendous investments in scientific research and innovation, It authorizes $45 billion to strengthen supply chains and prevent shortages of critical materials, and also expands our investments in development and diplomacy internationally to help try to bring stability to the world so we have less adversaries that are involved in the critical things we need in our supply chain. So I think the Competes Act will be the biggest, most important thing we can do to address the issue of supply chain. The House version passed, the Senate version passed. They're now in conference even today as we speak, trying to finalize this. But we've got to get that done because I think that's going to do the most to address the current issues of the supply chain.
So David Dollar, I know you've written extensively about supply chain issues, workforce issues, and also some of the complications of onshoring, possibly bringing jobs back to the United States. So what are the things that concern you the most in this area?
Well, let me start by saying it's a great pleasure to be here and to join this panel. And I want to start on a positive nod to your report, Daryl. I encourage everyone to read it. It's got a lot of good recommendations. And listening and reading your report, listening to Leslie, the main area of overlap there, I think, is really around the whole issue of logistics. A lot of what Leslie was just talking about was different failures in logistics within the United States, frankly. Ports, trucking, rail, and then, of course, lots of other countries around the world have had problems with logistics. So I think that it's an area where the government is already heavily involved as a regulator, and it's realistic to expect that we can have much better functioning. But then, Daryl, on the issue of onshoring, reshoring, I think we need to be pretty careful. Totally agree with the congressman that there's going to be some production with national security implications. High-end semiconductors is a good example where we want to make sure production occurs in the U.S. But on the other hand, if we try to do that across the board for manufacturing, I think that's going to end up being extremely expensive. We actually have a very successful, vibrant manufacturing sector, and it's got deep ties with countries all around the world. And if we try to artificially bring production back to the United States, that's probably going to be costly and unsuccessful. Remember, we have very low unemployment and high inflation. So if we want to do a lot more of something, if we want to do a lot more manufacturing, then we're basically saying we want to do less of something else. We want to have less education or less health care, because the key thing I want to add to the discussion is there's no free lunch. Okay? So among the different recommendations, I thought the ones on logistics were realistic and would potentially have a very significant impact on how our existing manufacturing base is operating and make it more successful and expanding. Last thing is totally agree with the congressman about research and development. We are at the high end of manufacturing, and we want to maintain that with a very strong research base. And I think that's a good use of public resources.
So Leslie, continue on this theme of logistics, which we all know is a big problem, and I'm sure it's an issue facing your company as well. How big of a problem is that, and how are you handling that? And are there things that either government and or businesses should be doing to ease problems in that area?
So it's a case by case, day by day, right? So we're trying to figure out, do you say, okay, if I'm bringing it over from overseas, do I want it on a boat? Can I afford the time on the boat? And if I need it immediately, do I go to an air freight? If I air freight, it's going to cost me 3 to 4 times what it's going to cost in a normal circumstance. We've been very diligently trying to nearshore, onshore, if you will, and look for other opportunities for suppliers who can supply to us. We're finding in many instances that it's 4 to 5 times what we're paying, but we're looking at those differentials and we're saying, does that make sense for us from a business standpoint? I think, and I'm going to jump back just for a moment and incorporate the semiconductor conversation back into this. Those semiconductors are very important to what we do. We're heating homes. So there's 9 million boilers in the U.S. So Takeo Comfort Solutions products are heating about 7.6 million homes in the U.S. That's heat. It's hot outside today, but it's going to be cold in a few months. What's going to happen with those chip allocations when we have automotive manufacturing is going to come online very soon. So we're trying to, and I can tie the logistics back into this, we're trying to source everywhere we can, looking for alternative sources. But we're going to have to start making some key decisions about where those microprocessors and those chips are allocated to. Because do we heat a home? We need cars, right? Everyone needs a car. So there are going to be some bigger discussions that are going to get incorporated into this conversation because we're talking about health and safety. So I think all of those things. I believe that the Secretary of Commerce is having a conversation today about microprocessors and chips and trying to figure out what that looks like. But those are all critically important issues to all of us at the end of the day, and especially a company like Takeo, who's very dependent on that for many of our products. But how is that going to get allocated? And the fact that many of those suppliers are offshore, we're going to have to figure out how to do that. And it's not going to be where I understand the research and development and the ability to want to build that back into our supply chain, but there's going to be a gap in timing. And so we're going to have real conversations about what happens in that gap period.
So, Congressman, I know for the past few years you've spent a lot of time working on competition in the marketplace, and your committee actually has already passed several bills to address these issues. How big are these competition, or I guess we should say lack of competition issues in a number of sectors contributing to supply chain problems?
Well, I think enormously. I mean, if you look at the concentration that has occurred in almost every sector of our economy over the last decade, it has been extraordinary. And when you have the kind of concentration that the absence of competition produces, you end up with less choice, less quality, higher prices, and less innovation, all which are deadly for supply chain and for manufacturing. And so this is a challenge because we have a lot of evidence to show that we need more competition and we need less anti-competitive behavior. But to be very candid, we've had a kind of failure for several decades in this country to really have robust antitrust enforcement in both Republican and Democratic administrations. I think we now have probably the most pro-competitive president we have ever had. The president issued an executive order really focused on the importance of competition to drive innovation and to drive the economy. He has people like Lena Khan at the FTC, Jonathan Cantor at the Department of Justice, Tim Wu at his National Economic Advisor. So he has the kind of the real stars of competition policy in his administration. And so I think this is a real opportunity to be sure that we're doing everything we can to promote competition that is going to not only be beneficial to the economy in the long term and to manufacturing, but really help to address supply issue problems. Because when you only have one or two companies that do something, if there's a failure in their ability to execute, that's the end of the supply chain. I mean, it stops there. So having, a diverse supply chain with lots of opportunities and lots of actors is obviously one way to have a resilient supply chain. And we've allowed so many areas of our economy, including in the logistics, to become more and more concentrated by fewer and fewer actors. That's a real problem.
And it seems like that actually was a big problem in the recent baby formula issue. Like there are 4 companies that basically make most of the baby formula here. When one of them shut down due to health and safety concerns, it disrupted the whole thing and probably created problems for even the 5th generation of the White family that is here today. David Dollar, I know China looms large in supply chain issues since so many goods and or components are made there. And of course, we now have very complicated relations there just based on trade, Russia, Ukraine, and national security in general. How can we handle the China relationship in a way that helps to mitigate some of these supply chain barriers?
Well, China is a difficult case, definitely. It's actually the largest producer of manufacturing value added in the world by a pretty large margin. Yeah, we actually have a pretty deep trade relationship despite the trade war and the tariffs. It's a pretty high level of integration between China and the United States. And I think perhaps more relevant is there's a very high level of integration between China on the one hand and South Korea, Japan, Germany. Our key partners are all really deeply integrated. So I think the Biden administration, they've been clear that they don't want to see decoupling from China, which would be very costly and for both economies, frankly. And I think importantly, I don't see that our partners would follow us down the road. relationship is much more important to those partners I mentioned. So I don't see them following us down a road of decoupling from China. So the challenge then is to create guardrails. I mean, what we're doing with our policies, we've got export controls on sensitive technologies. We've got various investment controls that also address sensitive technologies. And I think it's a hard thing to implement, but I believe that that's the right policy. It's what former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson called, you want to have a small yard with a high fence. So you want to define a pretty small number of technologies where we don't want to have this deep integration with China. And then we want to have a high fence, basically. We want to make sure that our export and investment controls work. And it's difficult politically because you're going to have special interests who want to be included in the yard, because they want to get some protection from China. And if it's not really a national security issue, then frankly, it's just cutting down on competition and it's going to raise costs for American firms. I think it's interesting. There's been enough time now. We've got some good research. These tariffs that President Trump introduced on China actually reduced manufacturing employment in the United States because while it protected a few very specific sectors, a lot of what we import from China would be parts and components. And when you start taxing those, then you're making American companies less competitive. And then the net result has been actually fewer manufacturing jobs than there would have been otherwise. Not huge changes, because frankly, trade policy is not really a good instrument. If you want more manufacturing jobs, trade policy is not a particularly good instrument for that. So I guess, without being too long-winded, I would focus a lot of that trade and investment policy on the national security issues very clearly, and then otherwise we should leave it up to businesses to make decisions. There are risks and problems operating in China. American businesses know that. And we know from the data they make a huge amount of profit there because this is the fastest growing market in the world. I guess that's the last point I would make, Darrell, is American companies at this point are mostly in China to sell to China. So some of the discussion, just doesn't seem to accept that reality that our companies, like take electric vehicles, for example, our companies earn a lot of profit there. That finances their R&D, and that keeps them at the forefront of their technology. If we decided arbitrarily we don't want American companies investing in China in any sector, then you're cutting out a big profit opportunity. And it's going to end up resulting in less research and development, less competitiveness. So it's a challenge to define that yard that I'm talking about, but I think that's the right policy.
Okay, and Congressman Cicilline, I know that you have to take off, but thank you very much for taking the time, and we appreciate hearing your comments. So Leslie, I want to come back to this issue of made in America, because on the one hand, many Americans support that idea. They like jobs coming back to this country. But on the other hand, we also know that bringing jobs back to America is expensive. The labor force is expensive. Energy costs are expensive, et cetera. So how do we balance these things, like bringing jobs back to the United States, but then dealing with what will inevitably be higher production costs?
So I think there's a delicate balance, right, that we all have to play. I think there's a lot of good things that I like about Made in America, but I think that it kind of prohibits and I think overlooks sometimes the fact that we still have American-based jobs that are doing the assembly side of that. So though I can't source 100% of those components in America, if I bring components in, we can still allow for American jobs to add value to that. So I think there's a delicate balance, right? Part of the challenge is everybody wants that discount brand, right? I want to pay discount dollars. Sometimes when we make it in America, we're going to have to charge more in pricing. And the end consumer doesn't always want to pay the additional cost. So we're going to have to figure out, how do we rectify that? How do we put a value add product into the marketplace that we can strategically position and say that this is worth the additional dollar investment? Then a lot of Americans don't want to pay anymore. They like the Walmart idea, not to to use them specifically, but they like, I can go get a discount brand. I can get it cheap and we can make it kind of in a throwaway fashion. Some of the products we're not making, they are investments. So I think we're going to have to figure out the strategies to make that work. We're all about investing in the American worker, but we also know that we have to play in a global economy. It forces us to do so to remain competitive and to keep those capabilities here in the U.S. We want to make products and services, but the way things have gone for the last several decades and businesses have gone overseas, we're forced to play in a global marketplace. We don't have any choice but to do that if we're going to remain competitive and we're going to have products and services that our consumers are willing to pay a fair price for. So there's a delicate balance of how we do that. It's not an all or nothing. It's not a net-sum game. I think there is a way that we can strategically do that, but it warrants the bigger conversation than saying 100% made and sourced in America.
Okay. David, I have one more question for you, then we're going to open the floor to questions from the audience, and we're also getting some online questions from our people watching over the webcast. So the computer chip area has been a big challenge for virtually every sector because chips are in everything, manufacturing, automotives, et cetera, et cetera. And we know that much of the current computer chip production capability is centered on Taiwan and South Korea. Congress is slowly starting to put some money into kind of bringing some of that capacity back to the United States. But given the importance of the computer chip sector to supply chains in particular, are there special things that we need to be doing in that area?
Well, in my view, the focus of policy should really be at the very high end, and particularly the chips that have military application, security application. And I think that, as you say, Daryl, for the moment, it's really only Taiwanese and Korean, and I think perhaps one Japanese firm, plus of course American firms. We've got several firms that produce at the high end, and we've got the Competes Act has $52 billion of subsidies. I think if that's well targeted, then that's money well spent. But it's, semiconductors is a vast area. There's a low end of things that go into, all kinds of simple electronics. China's a big producer at the low end. I think if we take a kind of protectionist approach that we want all the semiconductors used in America to be made in America, that's going to be extremely expensive. And then plus the high end countries I all mentioned, Japan, South Korea, those are formal allies. Taiwan's a friend. So I also think we want to think hard about, do we want to start shaping policy that essentially, undercuts some of our key allies in the Asia Pacific? It's not like we're buying high-end semiconductors from China, and I think we'll probably continue to have a cautious policy in that area. So it is, it's such a vast area, and the shortage, particularly the shortage for automobiles, caught a lot of people's attention. But that was primarily, I'd love to hear Leslie's view in this. My sense is that was primarily just a business mistake. Auto companies, including American auto companies, misjudged the situation. They thought demand was going down. They cut back their orders. The semiconductor companies, they made orders with electronic firms because electronics demand was going up. And then the auto companies discovered they were short, but they had made a bad business decision. Suppose all the semiconductors were made in the U.S., it would have been the same mess, right? Because those semiconductor companies, they all have contracts. They made contracts with, say, Japanese electronic firms. They weren't going to abrogate those contracts in order to deliver semiconductors to American auto companies. If it were a genuine national security issue, sure. But just because of a bad business decision, I think I don't see how we could have bailed them out of that. So some of this is really just a matter of business decisions, and we should be very careful about what we're subsidizing with public money.
Okay, Leslie, I see you reacting to that, so I want to hear your reaction. Then we're going to take questions from the audience. Go ahead.
I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I think part of what happened, I don't know if it were bad business decisions. I think part of what happened is COVID, right? You had factories that were shutting down. They were taking their workers out. They were having to segregate them. They were having to keep people at home. And I think that those disruptions and those supply chains started putting less product into the marketplace, and then you had everyone clamoring because they weren't getting their standard supply chain. Maybe there was some misjudgment, and I can't speak for the automotive industry. I can talk about from our industry. We had forecasted extremely well. We knew exactly what we wanted, and then when they started pulling additional demand and started saying, no, we're going to stop, we're going to give you an allocation, which was 50% less than what we had forecasted with them. That's not a business decision. That's a supply decision. That was the supply chain dictating to us what we were going to get and have the ability to produce product with. So I would challenge a little bit there of what came first, chicken or the egg. I know at the end of the day, we ended up trying to source and redesign boards on the fly so that we could make our products and figure out a way around it. And I think, again, thank God for the TACO team and the innovation and ingenuity there, but they figured some of that out. But we're still have lags in our supply chain, specifically around those microprocessors, because they're critical to what we do now. It's the newest technology. It allows for the highest efficiency pumps that we can put in the marketplace, and we need them, and we still don't have that supply is not set. And I don't see that supply getting set for the next couple of years, quite honestly. I don't know if it will reset within that time period.
Okay, we're going to take some questions from you here who are in person. We also have some questions from our online audience, but we'll give you the opportunity first. If you have a question, raise your hand. We have people with microphones who can come to you. There's a question back there. And if you can just introduce yourself, give us your name, and if you're with a particular organization.
Hi. First of all, thank you for putting this event on. It's been a wonderful time. I'm Abhinav Karthikeyan, rising sophomore at Yale and current analyst at the United Western Group. My question is related to kind of the whole retirement and age issue kind of going on in the supply chain. You know that around the average age of machinists in the supply chain is around 55 to 60-year-olds. And they have such intricate knowledge about small parts and these small, highly critical parts in the supply chain. What do you go about replacing this intricate knowledge, and how do you solve the kind of labor constraints and labor shortages that are caused by kind of the retirement and age issues that we see on the supply chain?
Well, I think you should jump in on
I can speak to that one a little bit. So what we're doing right now is we're trying to partner up, right? We know folks who are hitting towards that retirement age, trying to partner them with other individuals so that we can have a knowledge transfer. When they leave, that institutional knowledge walks out the door with them. So I think we're trying to do a really good job of making sure that we're partnering those so that we can keep some of that institutional knowledge. I think part of what some of the career and tech programs you're seeing now that are coming out with new programs is that they are trying to partner some of these, well, I don't want to call them older folks because I have this color hair, seasoned. We're seasoned now. Trying to take some of our more seasoned individuals and really pairing them up with some of the younger folks or your early career folks who are just starting out. There's still a gap, right? And there are not many people who want to go into to be a machinist, to be a tool maker. And so we're trying very hard to make sure that we can show that that's a great job. You can raise a family on it. You're going to earn a really great wage, and that there's a career path for you there. And I think if you look at some of the people who work for our company who've been there for 25, 30 years, it proves out the fact that it's a good career and it's a good way to raise your family. But it's making sure that younger generation can know and understand what those careers mean and their ability to get into them and get those skill sets so that they can enjoy that career path as they get into the workforce. It's a challenge, though. There's no doubt.
Okay, there's a person right there who has a question. And again, if you can just introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you for being here. My name is David Dye. I'm a student currently at Grinnell College in Grinnell, Iowa. My research focus has a lot to do with competition, antitrust, things like that. So you mentioned about Competes Act, about having a subsidy for, say, semiconductor companies. But what I'm seeing is really a problem, between the barrier of entry, intellectual property and also the basic anti-competitive behavior. So I wonder, how can we solve this supply chain problem by reducing the barrier of entry, by really subsidizing smaller firms, research and development, and all those, how to break down this barrier of entry to have smaller producers here in the U.S. actually produce and to compete in the international stage?
Well, it's too bad we don't have the congressman here, because I think he's really an expert on this. So what I would put out there, so first, one of the reasons why I'm one of the last remaining enthusiasts for free trade is that that's the best competition policy you can have, because you've got firms all over the world, even the semiconductors we discussed, where there's really probably 5 major firms. 5 is enough to generate a significant amount of competition. And then if you don't have free trade, you're very unlikely any one country is going to have more than 1 or 2 big semiconductor companies. So then you've clearly got a monopolistic situation. And then we have these very careful, competition policy laws, the antitrust laws, and the congressman expressed a view that for decades we haven't really seriously enforced them. And I'm not an expert in this area, but that resonates with me, that we've seen an awful lot of mergers into larger and larger entities, and the quality of all kinds of services goes down and certain prices go up. So I think enforcing our competition law, taking a hard look at, does it need to be updated because of changes in the modern world? And then most importantly, we should remain open to foreign trade.
Other questions from our audience? There's a microphone coming up from behind you.
Thank you. I'm Eric Churchill. I'm with UPS. We're a global shipping and logistics company. David, you mentioned some of the domestic challenges we have in logistics, and I just wanted to see if you could go a little bit deeper into some of those. And in particular, given the political constraints, we have worker negotiations going on in rails and at the ports right now. Investment can be challenging and very long to complete. Some modernization projects and ports, et cetera. Just wanted to see kind of how you think about we could break some of those political constraints in order to improve our logistics and lower costs and get products moving faster. Thank you. Right.
So I don't have any easy ideas on this very important question. And Daryl, you may want to weigh in on this too, because you've got interesting labor market ideas. But in my sense, I think one thing I bring to this conversation is I get to work on a lot of different countries. And it seems to me in the United States, we have an expectation that employers will provide, benefits and pay and all kinds of things. And on the other hand, we don't have a lot of public services, frankly. We don't have universal pre-K to take care of children, for example. Our Social Security program is running out of money. Medicare has got I'm old enough now to tell you Medicare's got lots of holes. So I, as an American citizen, I would favor that we do a lot more in terms of essentially public support for the various components that make up good jobs and good wages, and not put all of that on the companies. So, of course, some of that we have to put on the companies.
And I would just add one quick footnote to that, just from a workforce development and job retraining front. Clearly we're in an era where there's just lots of changes affecting the workforce. Technology changes and just changes in business models and so on. And so as a country, we need to take job retraining more seriously than we do. There are a number of companies that are basically doing it on their own, and I applaud those companies. But we need state and local government to be more active in this area. We actually spend quite a bit of public money in this area, but we don't seem to be getting very good results. The people who come out of those programs often have difficulty finding jobs. So somehow we need to target the job training more effectively so that people come out of those programs with skills that employers actually require.
There are a couple of countries that do this well: Germany, South Korea. And the key seems to be that the companies have to have a key role in defining designing the training, because they know what the needs are, and then you need a little bit of public subsidy, because this is a classic area of externality where if the company puts all the money into training people, a certain number of them are going to leave to other companies, and so that's the justification for some public support.
I have a question from one of our online viewers, and it concerns this issue of reshoring. And the question is, which industries are most likely to reshore? And I would just add on to that, are there particular industries that we should want to reshore versus others that are less critical, mission specific? And some people refer to computer chips as one of those sectors, but I'm just curious your thoughts. Like, are there particular sectors or particular industries that we should want to come back, either for economic competition reasons or national security reasons?
Well, I can tell you from a TACO perspective, I could give you a whole list of companies that I want to come back. Are they a priority for the entire nation? I don't think so, right? And I think it's going to depend on what industry are the most important to come back. But there are some. When we talk about things like microprocessors, when we talk about things like chips, when we talk about things, I would love to see to have some casting capabilities, but we're in a regulatory environment where, do we really want those jobs to come back? Do we want the smelting companies to come back that are steel companies? They all have regulatory impact, and we get a lot of people who will say, okay, we want that one, but not that one. And I don't know if we should be in that position of picking winners and losers. I think if people want to make a solid investment here, and they feel like that they have a marketplace here and they've identified that, we should provide an opportunity for them to come back. But again, that's the marketplace driving those decisions. But I think we can do a better job at looking globally and strategically. Manufacturing is a national defense priority. It should be. It's also a health and safety priority. We're going to make those things that are going to make sure that they protect us. And I think from that perspective, we can look at critical manufacturers to do that. Do I know that list? No, I don't know off the top of my head. But I also think there's something that we should allow for the free market, right? And we should allow for them to be able to have fewer barriers to entry, that it's not so cumbersome, that you can actually start those. The gentleman in the back was talking about small, innovative companies. I would challenge that and say there's some company who's been here for 100 years, right? Who a strategic investment in what they're doing from a research and development or a design capability are just as worthy an investment. So I think that that needs to be a broader discussion as well.
David?
So, didn't really answer that, so sorry, but my thoughts.
Okay.
No, I thought that was a really great answer. And I wouldn't want to be in charge of making this list, basically. One thing to keep in mind is that our economy is so complex. We put things in these boxes. We talk about manufacturing versus services. In about half of the value added in stuff these days comes from service sectors, right? Because stuff is increasingly smart. It's got, software is a service sector. And whatever we're talking about, you've got complicated value chains where telecom, transportation, these are all service sectors, logistics. They're all very important. So what do you end up with is more than 50% of the value of a physical product comes from service sectors. And I think in the real world, there's an awful lot of interconnection between the two. So it's kind of hard to delineate. Well, we want to subsidize manufacturing. We care less about services, but given the inputs moving from services into manufacturing, I think that's a little artificial.
I'll just challenge a little bit because I do believe service sectors, manufacturing is wealth creating, right? We're bringing wealth back in and adding that back into the economy. And I think service sector is some of that, but I also think that there's some of that's more of a shifting around.
Well, it's fun to argue with you, but presumably your firm has some patents and intellectual property, right? Okay. The services from that are considered services in the national account.
Fair
so
enough.
you look at a firm like Apple, for example, right? And from my point of view, Apple seems like a big manufacturer, but it mostly shows up in the U.S. data as the service sector because they're inventing stuff and they're earning money off their patents, and that's all considered services.
Fair enough.
Okay, I have another question from one of our online viewers. And the question is, President Biden is proposing cooperation between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico to strengthen North America supply chains, while at the same time touting the benefits of Buy American policies. The question is, should the U.S. be thinking about turning Buy American into a regional program that cuts across the three countries, the U.S., Canada, and Mexico?
I was going to say I'm going to let you have that one. Should they look at it as a North American? Is that so? That's the question there.
As opposed to Buy American, Buy North American.
I'd have to noodle that one a little bit. I think there is something about buying from our strategic allies and partners and our neighbors that makes that interesting. I don't know what the benefits of that would be, because what I don't want to do is, from a TACO perspective, I want to have access to those products and services. I'm not sure. I have to think about that one a little bit. That one's I have to think about whether I think that's an added value. Because what you want to be able to do is get those products and services, but still make sure, because if it's adding value to an American worker and there's a job there for them, and yeah, I have to think about that one. Sorry, I'm stumbling on that one. You stumped me there for a minute.
I would just add, the United States is much bigger than Mexico or Canada, and I would say, these are neighbors and close allies. I would say we have an interest in helping with their prosperity. So cutting these smaller economies off from the United States is actually going to be penalizing them quite a bit. And I think it's more rhetoric than anything. I mean, we've extended our free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico into the USMCA. The autos part of that, they've really eliminated free trade in autos, I'll just be frank, which is one important sector. But otherwise, we have quite an open situation among the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. That seems like a sensible policy. But then, as I think Leslie was implying, we also have allies like Germany, United Kingdom, France, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. Taiwan's not an ally, but it's a friend. So, are we now encouraging our firms to discriminate against these key partners? That doesn't make any sense to me, either economically or geostrategically.
Yes, right. I'd have to think about there's always unintended consequences, right? And I'm not sure that I know enough about that if I look at it on a bigger scale to be able to, but it's definitely worth pondering.
One last question from our online audience, and then we'll give you the last question. What is the impact of the U.S.-China strategic rivalry on global supply chains? And I'll just tack on, are there things that we should be doing in that relationship that would then help us with this topic in particular?
So you must have some suppliers from China.
Of course
right?
we do.
Yeah.
Sure. So,
yeah, I mean, the whole relationship with China has become very complicated. As I said, we continue to import large amounts of stuff and lots of parts and components used by American firms. It's become so sensitive. Mostly, I think they want to keep their heads down, when it comes to that. But we are the two biggest economies in the world, and the number 3, Japan, is far behind. So this is the world we live in. The U.S. and China are similar size. China is actually the biggest trading nation, the biggest recipient of direct foreign investment. And I think it's in our economic interest to work out, modus operandi with China. It's not easy, but there are lots of clearly non-strategic sectors of the economy. We still import a lot of clothing from China, for example. Lots of non-strategic sectors of the economy where we want trade and investment to flourish. And then, I don't want to repeat myself at length, but we do have to define what I view as a small number of national security relevant technologies, really focus our controls on those.
China is an excellent marketplace, right? It's a great place to buy goods and service and move things around, but there are challenges to doing business there. You've got transportation challenges. There are new regulations that just passed in the U.S. that now, as an American company, we're required to make sure that we can verify that they're not using forced labor and all of those things. And I don't want it to seem overly burdensome, but they're additionally, again, a thing that a U.S.-based manufacturer, if they're using any of the Chinese products and services, now there are requirements that we have to make sure that they're looking at their supply chains, that they're looking at their raw material suppliers, that they're not using forced labor, that they're sourcing that in a responsible way. So there are additional things that come up when we select to do business with China that we have to pay attention to from our side, because the penalties for a U.S. manufacturer, if they don't comply with those regulations and they're not monitoring it, can be pretty stiff. We also have to make sure that we are keeping our intellectual property very secure, and that we're not inadvertently transferring that, or if we are giving information, that we do it knowing that we're doing that, and that we're doing it in a very kind of proactive way, but we also know that we're doing everything we can to protect that, because you don't want to lose control of that, because you can lose control of your intellectual competitive advantage in many ways, unknowingly sometimes. So it's strategic. You have to be thoughtful, and it does require some additional diligence.
Okay. For our last question on this panel, right here, there's a microphone coming up right behind you.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking to us. I'm Pranav. I'm an incoming sophomore at Yale and South Asia research intern at the Hudson Institute. So my question is, because of the trade war and COVID lockdowns and things like that, we've seen a lot of countries in the Indo-Pacific, like Vietnam, Japan, and India, try to kind of bring companies away that are trying to move away from China towards their own countries. So I'm curious, how would you rate the level of success that these countries have had at these efforts? And do you think that longer term that these countries will be successful at onshoring companies that are moving away from China?
So I think Vietnam has been the most successful. Quite a bit of labor-intensive assembly has moved out of China to Vietnam. But keep in mind, China is enormously bigger than Vietnam, so only a small amount. And then there are a few other countries, but there are really not too many other attractive production locations. And the way this is actually happening in practice is these are mostly Chinese companies that are moving their factories to Vietnam or Cambodia, and they're continuing to export machinery and parts and components, and now they're doing the low-end assembly in Vietnam, for example, and then quite legally that comes into the U.S. without facing the 25% tariff. So I would say it's certainly not a big problem for China. It's kind of pushing China more quickly into the role of foreign investor and exporter of machinery and sophisticated stuff, and pushing China out of the low end, which they were going to be pushed out of anyway because their labor force is starting to decline and their wages are going up. So it's, the geopolitical situation is accelerating an economic trend. Last thing, I'm an economist. I think economics tends to win out. If geostrategic considerations are pushing you in the economic direction, then things go a little faster. If you're trying to go against the economic factors, probably the economic factors are going to win. So, we've had all of this trade war with China. We've got more trade with them than ever before, right? So that's the economics.
Okay, we're out of time on this particular panel, but I want to thank Leslie and David for sharing your insights. Great thoughts here, and appreciate you taking the time to do it. And then now we're going to move to our second panel of experts. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Are you? All right. So for our second panel, we have two individuals who have extensive experience on manufacturing and supply chain issues. So I'd like to welcome my colleague, Joshua Meltzer. He's a senior fellow in our Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings, and he's an expert on trade and manufacturing issues and thinks a lot about supply chain issues in particular. And then also joining us is Rachel Hoff, who is the policy director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. And she writes regularly about manufacturing policy and ways to help that sector. So thanks to each of you for joining us. So Josh, I want to start with you. Obviously, we heard from our first panel, there are many challenges in the supply chain area. Many would like to bring jobs back to the United States, but how realistic are the possibilities for doing that?
Well, I think in part it depends on what we are talking about when we think about the types of jobs that we think should be back in the United States. Just from a macro perspective, we've clearly got a very tight labour market at the moment with rising wages really across the whole band. And in fact, wages are rising a lot more rapidly at the lower end than they are at the upper end, which is a positive development for the country overall. But it points out one of the sort of macro challenges which came up, I think, in the last panel, which is that in this type of environment, if you're going to bring jobs back to be employed in a manufacturing sector that is not currently here, there's going to be less jobs and less opportunity to do something somewhere else. And so I think we just need to think carefully about what areas that we want to bring jobs back into and what that matters. So this is sort of this intersection, I think, of what's economically sustainable over time in the United States and what's strategically necessary or what's necessary from a security perspective. And this is, I think, this intersection between national security and economics, or geostrategy and economics, and what we can make work and what we can make work well. I mean, one of the things that I am a little concerned about is there's a lot of enthusiasm at the moment for government investment into supporting reshoring, ally-shoring, whatever we want to call it, rebuilding certain manufacturing sectors, which overall can be a positive thing. But if we don't do it well, and if we spend a lot of money and don't get good results, we're going to reaffirm the view that government spending in these areas is a waste of money, and we probably won't do it again for another generation. So I want to make sure that what we do now is effective and well-targeted and actually produces outcomes that are going to be here not just for 1 or 2 or 3 years, but for 10 and years, and produce sustainable companies. So, I don't want to. I was following the conversation in the panel before, and I don't want to repeat a lot of what was said there. But I think, David's sort of categorization of we want to make sure that we are. He was talking about this in terms of China, but I think I would broaden out this idea that we want to be doing more in this country of what we determine is necessary from either a national security perspective or from a sort of a slightly broader, maybe resilience perspective. Those things are not necessarily overlapping, obviously. It's also not necessarily the case that either national security or resiliency leads you to the conclusion that you should be doing it all in the United States. I mean, the IMF and others have done some good work recently, and I think these conclusions are pretty intuitive, which is that you're more resilient if you have a variety of suppliers, if you have substitutability in your supply chain. If you have it all concentrated in one area, then shocks to the system mean that the shocks are amplified. And so resiliency and national security may even suggest that we don't necessarily crowd it all back into the United States, that we look at particularly trusted allies where we can build additional capacity and so forth. Having cleared my throat on that, though, that would be my kind of framing, right? And so then we get into some of the areas which I think have already been discussed around, I think there's a good argument for more semiconductor manufacturing. I mean, that's concentrated in a couple of countries, and there are risks there. There's an argument, I think, possibly for thinking more carefully about medical devices and what we need, what capacity we need for future, pandemics and so forth. There are some industries in the United States which maybe are less critical from a national security perspective, like autos, but are clearly critical industries from a broader sort of economic resilience manufacturing perspective. And when you think about obviously transitioning into EVs, what does that supply chain look like? How do we make sure that we remain competitive in that? So I'd sort of think about it through those lenses, and I think that would lead you to a fairly narrow range of industries, which I think there's an argument for focusing on.
Okay, great, thank you. And Rachel, first of all, thank you for joining us. And I'm curious your thoughts on what are the best ways to address global supply chain issues? What are the problems you're most worried about, and how can we deal with those issues?
Well, thanks so much for having me, and to Brookings for hosting the important discussion. Let me associate myself with my colleagues' comments here and also several of the threads that came out of the previous panel that just to say, the way that I think about this and the way that the Reagan Institute has focused on this set of issues is pretty narrowly tailored to that national security lane, to where there's an overlap between our domestic manufacturing competitiveness and kind of the strategic sectors that are critical to maintain in terms of our global competitive position. I agree that there may be a broader conversation around other industries that are important to our national resilience or our economic resilience, but our work in this space and a report that we put out just a few months ago looks specifically at that intersection with national security, and I think many of the recommendations resonate with those, Daryl, from your report. In terms of where those, and let me kind of pick up on maybe some of the questions from the previous panel and then get to key challenges and solutions. In terms of where those sectors are, there's actually been a lot of work done in both the Biden administration and the Trump administration, out of the White House and the Department of Defense, from the House Armed Services Committee, as well from Capitol Hill, in identifying exactly what those sectors are, what those critical capabilities are, and what capacity we need to have in the United States or to the point with close allies and partners. Some of them have already been addressed: chips, semiconductors, microelectronics, but also energy storage and batteries. There's a conversation around obviously our kinetic military capabilities and industries, sort of more in the traditional defense industrial base. And then, of course, a lot of conversation around rare earth minerals and critical materials in that regard. So I'd encourage you to read some of those reports from the House Armed Services Committee, Critical Supply Chain Task Force, and again, reports out of DoD from both the Biden and Trump administrations over the last few months in response to executive orders saying where exactly do these critical capabilities lie, and what industries do we need to encourage here at home, incentivize here at home. I think in terms of challenges and solutions, I think the previous panel touched on much of what we've found in this regard as well. Workforce challenges, certainly, I think, at the heart of any conversation about manufacturing capabilities. Obviously, COVID and the pandemic unveiled a lot of those challenges, both on the workforce side, on the supplier ecosystem side. But I think those challenges, were there before. The skills gap between the workforce that our employers need and the job applicants coming into the market is huge. And there's, I think, a role for, I think the question I always come back to is, where's the role for government in providing some of these solutions, helping the private sector provide some of these solutions, specifically where it's tailored to our national security needs.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. So Josh, on the logistics front, it seems like any discussion of global supply chain issues immediately gets into logistical considerations and then especially transportation issues. It seems like that has been a big bottleneck both on the cargo ship front as well as some of the air supply. So I'm just curious how you see the problems in that area and then possible solutions in dealing with those issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely correct. So, on the one hand, I think there's a sort of domestic infrastructure investment component, and I know you touched on that in the previous panel, and obviously that's going to build up steam over time here in the US through the infrastructure bill that passed and other investments that are coming online. There are specific bottlenecks which everyone's aware of. 40% of shipping traffic goes through 2 ports in California, through California and Long Beach, and there's been effort. The White House has obviously been engaged on those fronts. We've got the Jones Act, which is a pretty restrictive piece of legislation which raises costs for shipping internally in the United States. So we end up with a lot of use of roads and rail and so forth. That's something which could be looked at from a competitiveness perspective. And then I think there's a broader, sort of infrastructure investment piece globally, and this interestingly I think intersects a little bit with the geopolitics as well, because at one level there's a huge infrastructure need globally, and if one thinks about the desire to encourage manufacturing and alternative supply chains outside of China, you need the infrastructure as just a key building block to enable that to happen. China's been investing in that obviously through their One Belt, One Road initiative, and there is now, I think, an increasing focus by the US and other allied countries to sort of providing additional finance and investment into infrastructure as well. And I think that's just a good thing overall from multiple perspectives, not just from an infrastructure supply chain perspective, but that is going to deliver some benefits over time in terms of creating new platforms for alternative supply chains. And so it underscores that there's sort of a domestic piece and there's a global coordination piece. I mean, we saw President Biden at the G20 last year call for, coordination and more infrastructure investment to sort of alleviate the supply chain bottlenecks. I think this is going to be a topic which will come up in the G20 this year. So there is that bit as well. But I think you're going to need both of those elements if we're going to get serious about kind of getting at that substrata of the supply chain piece.
Rachel, I'd love to get your thoughts on this logistics piece as well, just in terms of both the problems you see and are there ways we can mitigate those issues?
Yeah, I think the infrastructure piece is a really important part of it. It's important to have roads and bridges, but it's also important to have factories that are capable of producing products to move across those key infrastructure pieces. And so I think thinking in new ways about both federal investment in this space, but also the money that's going to states. A lot of states, saw a big influx of capital with infrastructure, for infrastructure spending, and to see to work together with states, more sort of federal, state, local coordination in order to understand how some of those dollars can be invested in ways that are helping address this problem. I think is a really important piece of this. A lot of governors and cabinets, some of them have human capital and positions built out to help understand these issues, but many do not.
So we know that COVID accentuated many of the problems in terms of supply chain, and hopefully we are starting to come out of that pandemic, although it seems like it's the pandemic that's never going to go away entirely. So Josh, I'm just curious your thoughts on how much of the current supply chain issue actually is COVID specific and pandemic specific, and what are the things that are actually likely to ongoing if somehow COVID starts to drop, not disappear, but drop to some more manageable level?
Yeah, so it's a mix. I mean, I think some of these supply chain bottlenecks have been building for a while, and so are more structural than COVID. COVID had, I mean, the response to COVID exacerbated some of these issues. I mean, certainly when it comes to, questions around, firstly, shutdowns, that's still going on in China. But that took capacity offline and completely disrupted supply chains. And I think that, really made clear the various dependencies and risks in the supply chain. That became very clear. Even in North America, we saw at the beginning, pretty uncoordinated border closures, which affected supply chains that got ultimately worked out. But even across North America, that eventually worked quite well in the end. But that again underscored some of the challenges there. Then we saw on the labour front, people just weren't going into work. So it was just difficult to produce things, and that was a factor that kind of rolled across the world with COVID. And then we've had, on top of that, these enormous stimulus packages to respond to COVID. I mean, the US in particular has had, I think it was $2 trillion last year. And so that's created enormous demand, and that put this additional, I think, stress on supply chain. So you've had these supply side issues, which I think have highlighted the challenges with the supply chain. And then we've run into this sort of combination of people staying home, a lot of pent-up demand, and then a lot of stimulus, which got released certainly last year in particular, and the two things collided, and we saw the supply chains really falter and come apart in some respects. So that's sort of, I think, now it's to the extent that is some of that is clearly going to dissipate over time, right? So, the demand side kind of stimulus piece is going to play out over the rest of this year. There's still a lot of savings in the US economy as a result of that. And, people are obviously speculating about now potential recessions next year and so forth with rising interest rates. So that piece will dissipate. The supply chain side of it is I think, also, this is, I think, the part of the focus here today in a sense, which is some of that supply chain, those supply chain issues are clearly working themselves out. So, the Long Beach, California port issue has improved, somewhat from, 6 months ago, for instance, and there is infrastructure investment going on and factories are opening up and so forth. It will, I put as a sort of a pretty significant asterisk, it will be important to see what happens with this new strain of COVID going around, which is extremely transmissible, which I understand is in China as well. And if they go back into major lockdowns, what that does to the supply side of the supply chains, that may well, still have a fair way to run. And then I think there's a question of what we do, how we want supply chains to look going forward. I mean, that's I think the unknown. But without further, leaving everything as it is, without further government intervention, if we just wanted to sit back and let things work themselves out, my expectation is that things would recalibrate over the next sort of 12 to 18 months, but back into something that looks not too dissimilar to 2019.
Rachel, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. How much was specific to COVID? And then Josh has presented what I would view as a somewhat optimistic view in terms of things going forward, perhaps returning shortly to the pre-COVID world. Where do you lie on?
Sure. I think, when we talk about logistics challenges and shutdowns and all of that, there's certainly clearly a case where some of the broader supply chain challenges that we're facing are in large part because of the pandemic. When it comes to the piece of this around our national security relevant or strategic sector manufacturing capabilities and our shortcomings in that regard, I think there's a lot of evidence to show that it predated the pandemic and only got worse in certain ways, but would have been bad anyway. I mentioned all the work that DoD across bipartisan administrations and also leaders on Capitol Hill are focusing on these issues. The executive order in the Trump administration, I think it was 13806, predated the pandemic, I believe. And so they're asking the DoD to look into supply chain shortages in these critical sectors and what can be done about it. So, in terms of outlook in that regard, not as good as it would have been if we had been pandemic free for the last 2.5 years. But I think the emerging, I should say, bipartisan consensus on these issues that there are these critical sectors in our economy and in our manufacturing sectors that matter to our strategic competition, particularly with regard to China, and that beyond that, there is a role for government in helping the private sector address those issues. My outlook is perhaps somewhat optimistic as well, because I think if the first step is understanding the problem and agreeing on the problem, I think we're well on our way there and can start talking about solutions. And certainly some of those have already been presented both on Capitol Hill and in the administration.
I like optimism. We can use some optimism in this town. So Josh, in the first panel, we talked a little bit about competition policy and the extent to which some supply chain issues might be being exacerbated by lack of fair competition in certain sectors. So I'm just curious your thoughts on that. How big of an issue is that as opposed to some of these other sources that we've been talking about?
To be honest, I'm not the intersection between this competition and supply chain issues. I'm not completely clear on. It's complicated. There's obviously a lot of focus on on the one hand, when you think about big companies and how they manage supply chains, one of the things they do, if you think about a Walmart or an Apple, for instance, Amazon, they actually drive down costs through their supply chains, and with the ultimate aim of trying to get low-cost products to consumers. Now, bracketing the question of whether there should be more competition at that end to sort of improve the outcomes and quality and so forth. So, but it is often like a capability that large companies have in the market to do that. Now, they don't necessarily need to be monopolistic or oligopolistic to achieve those outcomes, but we are seeing obviously more concentration. But my point simply is that that intersection between largeness and bigness and supply chains and whether that is actually a good or a bad thing is not clear. There's a lot of coordination, costs and complexity that often big companies manage well and so forth. Then, there's the question about whether or not there's enough sort of competition in the market when you think about the focus at the moment, particularly on the tech sector, has sort of come off this idea that's been prevalent in the competition policy space that we've ultimately been looking very much at consumer prices and consumer benefits. And we've seen, in the tech sector, a lot of essentially declining prices and a lot of free products and goods and services. And so we've been less concerned about the concentration in that sector over time. We are, of course, more concerned about it because we've started to rethink about what free means and look at it, in a broader sense. But whether or not that is actually whether more competition, how more competition in that sector is going to impact supply chains itself, I think is complicated. So I don't actually come down firmly one way or the other on what those two intersections are, but I can see bigness actually generating a lot of supply chain benefits. But there are obviously where you genuinely think there's concentration in the market, there are going to be costs at the other end, which is a genuine focus for competition policy.
Rachel, your thoughts on the competition policy issue?
Well, speaking as somebody from the Ronald Reagan Institute, I'm pro-competition and pro-free market, certainly. And I think that, to the conversation on the previous panel around this isn't about picking in winners and losers. There's a really important kind of conceptual point to be made about when we think about competition or even, the government role in any of these areas and how industrial policy plays into this conversation. There are kind of two ways of thinking about that. One is sort of a vertical approach where you have sort of a government role in a really specific or niche area of the economy or to support particular firms. Then there's more of kind of a horizontal approach, which is this is about sort of broadly across big sectors of the economy, creating a talent ecosystem, a supplier ecosystem, a capital ecosystem, a capital investment ecosystem that allows firms to succeed. And I think that when we think about it more in terms of that horizontal approach, it sort of gives us more of a sense of how and when there's a government role here, and that sort of identifies where competition then still is an important part of the system, without having that vertical, deep in the weeds government role that would eliminate the role of competition.
So, Josh, on workforce issues, how do you see either the worker shortages that we've seen in a number of areas, or just lack of proper worker training for the skills of some of the new industries that are developing, contributing to supply chain issues?
Yeah, so a couple of observations. I know this came up before, so I'll try to say something different. One is I think we need immigration reform. This is absolutely, I think, essential when we think about building. I mean, this has been such a strength of this country, and it will continue to be if we think about this. Particularly through the economic lens, I think it's absolutely essential. The other piece is. What is, I think, abundantly clear is not so much that there are not going to be jobs around, but there's going to be a mismatch between the skills that the jobs require and the skills that the workers have. And this is well understood, and increasingly, as whether it's in manufacturing or services, it's all increasingly high-level, high-skilled work. I mean, in the manufacturing sector, increasingly, that's absolutely the case. I know on the panel before you were talking about, businesses do some of this, and I think Dave made the comment about, there is obviously a requirement for government role here to the extent that there's sort of, a social benefit which exceeds sort of the return that businesses can capture for their investments. I will say that I know that governments have been spending, you made the point, Daryl, that there has been some significant investment with not that great return in terms of upskilling and job training, and some other countries do it better. There are, I have to say, beyond sort of firms training workers for their own use and governments providing it, there's a third thing that's developed, which is that there's a lot of really interesting businesses that are now private firms which are essentially taking on the role of filling this gap, trying to train workers, but doing it in a way which works very closely with businesses, identifying what their skills needs are, taking students often out of at the end of high school or at early stages but when they're thinking about the next steps, and moving them into these programs which are accredited and recognised and have very high rates of return in terms of getting jobs at the end of it, because they're closely tied with industry needs. And there's a couple of excellent companies, I'm not going to name them, in the UK doing this, in the US as well. And so I think there's a real development there which is worth thinking about as sort of also part of the solution here, rather than, there's maybe instead of more government funding, which hasn't produced great results so far, is thinking about how that space can be built out, and potentially there's a private sector / public sector role for building programs which are much more attuned to workers' needs, but are not relying solely on the firms to do it themselves.
And it's interesting you mentioned immigration reform. We should mention the last major immigration bill passed in the United States was under President Reagan, definitely. So a lot of current Republicans have forgot about that. But your thoughts either on the immigration angle or just workforce and skill development in general.
Let me speak broadly to the workforce piece in particular, and I'll get to the immigration question later on. But there's so I mentioned the Reagan Institute put out a report on manufacturing competitiveness and national security. We convened a task force over the course of 2021, bringing leaders from the private sector, current and former government officials, thought leaders together, and the task force really focused in on this workforce challenge and wanted to develop some potential solutions. And I want to highlight one of them that I think plays on what Josh was saying about sort of the government funding hasn't always solved this problem, but clearly the private sector knows what their needs are. So one idea that the task force came up with that I think is worthy of consideration is around reallocating some of the federal education dollars that, for example, Pell Grants, that currently can only go to degree-granting colleges and universities, so 4 or 2-year degrees. A lot of the skills that are needed to address our manufacturing shortcomings are high skill. I think there's an immigration piece there. But a lot of them are also just basic trade capabilities, and our workforce development in that regard is lacking as well. So training programs, even if they are led by these private sector firms, perhaps in partnership with, say, a community college, but not toward a degree at the end of the program, but even just private firms in their own regard, to host these workforce training programs. They know the skills that they need out of their workforce. If we made federal dollars which follow the student, Pell Grants follow the student. If the student goes to a 4-year college, they get the money. If they go to a community college, they get the money. Well, they should be able to go to a workforce training, skills training program as well, and have some federal support in terms of educational dollars following them to those programs, given the skills gap problems that we're facing writ large. One advantage, I think, of this approach is that, of course, it's the larger firms and companies that are going to have the ability, the capital, the facilities to host these workforce training programs. But they'll have effects that will benefit the small and medium-sized enterprises as well that maybe can't stand up their own workforce training programs. So if you imagine a big defense firm that hosts a training program for some of these critical capabilities, and then they hire a certain number of those workers, there are going to be surplus workers that are now trained and maybe have a certificate in that from that training program that can then go on to be hired by some of these smaller or medium-sized enterprises that don't have the ability to stand up these these programs on their own. I also think there's a whole conversation here around stackable credentials and where you can maximize some efficiencies in that regard. Let me just speak briefly, though, to the immigration piece. And I think this especially comes into play on the higher skill end of the workforce and skills gap that we're facing. We have to be able to graduate a certain amount of American STEM talent from our colleges and universities. We also have to and have traditionally benefited from the brain drain of the rest of the world, bringing the best and brightest talent, especially in STEM fields, to the United States to educate them at our colleges and universities. We then largely we fail to provide any way for them to stay and to work on our country's biggest challenges. Some of them won't want to, some of them will, and I think reforming our immigration system to allow these students and graduates a mechanism to stay will continue to leverage what's always been great about America, which is that people want to come here and work with some of the best companies in the world on addressing some of the hardest challenges in the world.
And just to extend that last point that she made, I've often made the argument, obviously America needs a technical workforce and people with science and technology and math skills. There are two ways to solve this problem. One is we could convince native-born American students to get interested in these STEM fields, or two, we could basically encourage immigrants to come here who often do have these skills, or they acquire them once they're here, and allow them to stay. Right now, America is screwing up both of those things. Native American students, by and large, are not studying these fields, and then we're cracking down on immigration. Like, we can screw up one of those two areas. We cannot screw up both of them, which is what we're currently doing, without there being a big cost in the long run.
And if I might, just on the sort of native-born piece, there's, we've all heard about, my parents and my siblings are all public school teachers, and all they talk about is STEM. It's STEM. My sister-in-law's an art teacher, and she's doing trainings on STEM in the art classrooms, right? I mean, it's STEM across the curriculum. The problem is, we do a good job of that now, at least at the primary and secondary level, but American students with STEM degrees tend to max out at the post-secondary level with a bachelor's degree and then cash out in Silicon Valley, to be frank. They're not going back for graduate degrees in STEM. They're not going back for PhD degrees in STEM in large enough numbers to fulfill sort of that side of the coin, although certainly both domestic and foreign talent, I think, are important in this regard.
So I have one last question for each of you on geopolitics, then we're going to open the floor to any questions that you may have. So, and obviously this came up on our first panel as well, but it's a topic that's hard to avoid, just the extent to which the complicated geopolitics of the world now impinges on supply chain issues. And the question is, like, how much of it actually is supply chain problems as opposed to supply chain problems that are exacerbated just by all the complex geopolitics of India, China, Russia, and the developing world? Josh?
Well, small question to end on. So, I think, part of, I think, what we saw over the last couple of years with the pandemic and the real disruption to supply chains, the concerns around, for instance, what does it mean when a certain amount of our medical equipment is manufactured or comes from China, and concerns that China might restrict those flows of goods and so forth. And it's this notion of trust, which has been hard to define, but I think no one's ever questioned this idea that if you were dependent on other countries, which is sort of inherently a byproduct of having global supply chains, that these would be used and for other sort of non-economic kind of purposes and so forth. And others have written about sort of the weaponization of supply chains, or the weaponization of sort of connectivity. And at some level, we have to get a handle on what do we really think our exposure is when various products and services are being manufactured overseas, and particularly which are critical and which are being manufactured by one or two suppliers, where if they really shut that off, we would be left without an alternative. because you can imagine, if you let your imagination run away, right, you can get concerned about everything because we are very globally integrated. I mean, David made the point, despite the tariffs, the last 5 years, trade with China is up 50%. So turning this off is very hard. We need to think about, I think, the globalization piece carefully because if we get it wrong, the costs are going to be very, very significant, and not just in terms of it will be very costly here in the United States. One of the things that is also clear is that while we may feel exposed by being part of supply chains and having, China being a critical supplier in various ways, the United States remains sort of the most centrally connected economy, which gives it actually huge leverage over other countries. I mean, that was made abundantly clear, I think, at the moment with what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. The sanctions, both on the goods side and on the financial side, was only made possible by the fact that Russia is still integrated into the global economy and actually depends on a huge amount of technology, which tends to come from the US and allies. And similarly, we may feel somewhat exposed to China, but China, on the other side, I think feels extremely exposed to their dependence on US technology and capital and finance and so forth. And so this is very much a two-way street, and undoubtedly China is looking at this as carefully as we are looking at this. In fact, China is also trying to, in a sense, deglobalize and reduce its dependencies at a rapid clip at the moment, notwithstanding, irrespective of what we think we should do. I mean, China's been trying to develop alternative, SWIFT and financial networks, and trying to globalize the RMB. And it's very clear that through their circular economy notion that they're trying to increase domestic production, a whole range of goods and services. So there's a process underway because it's become very clear that supply chains, if we understand them as networks, have created dependencies which in a world of geopolitical tension start to look a little unsustainable. From our perspective, I think we need to think about this so in terms of what are our risks, but also how do we actually sustain these networks, these supply chains, because they're also good for us economically, but they're actually also good for us strategically as well. Shutting America off from these networks is actually ultimately just going to be an own goal because we are, as I said, central to those networks and actually get a lot of power as a result of those networks. So I would want to think about this, coming back to I think what we were saying at the very beginning, through a very sharp national security lens. What are our genuine areas of risk and exposure? And I think that's going to be a manageable set of issues at the end of the day. It's going to be very technology focused, but not entirely. There's going to be critical minerals that go into batteries and so forth, which we're going to have to look at carefully, clearly. But then there's going to be a whole range of other areas where I think that we can genuinely say that the market should decide and firms should be free to engage and build supply chains where it's most efficient. And I think we're not close to getting that balance. There's processes underway, such as in the Department of Commerce, and what the export controls ultimately look like, which I think will help set some of those parameters. But I think we're going to have to grapple with that. But that's sort of how I sort of think about that intersection between geopolitics and supply chains.
Yeah, all great points. Rachel, your thoughts on our complex geopolitics? Then we will take some questions from the audience.
I think what I would add, in brief, is sort of the nature of the competition itself is important, and it's really critical to understanding American strengths in that competition. So, particularly in the competition in this regard vis-a-vis China, there are real advantages to a state-driven system. There are real advantages to a system, if you're looking to maximize everything we've been talking about today, to having little, if any, distinction between your public and private sector. However, that's not the American way, and I think that the leaning into American strengths with regard to in this competition, with regard to our free and open system, with regard to competition, with regard to innovation, is how America has succeeded in the past, and to end on a note of confidence, how I think we'll succeed in this competition as well.
Okay, great. Let's open the floor to any questions that you have. Just raise your hand. We have a couple questions over here. So we'll start with the young lady. Well, then we'll come to you. No, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Chi Xiang. I'm a master's student at Harvard University. I've got a question about the relation of inflation towards some of these supply chain challenges we face today. There have been questions in the Biden administration about whether lifting tariffs on China will allow for inflation to be tamed, while at the same time, Indonesia, for instance, has put export restrictions on crude palm oil because they want to manage the increasing price of energy back at home. So my question is, how do you see this sort of inflation affecting the ability of states, the behavior of states in relation to global supply chains? Thank you.
The China tariffs bit is obviously got an economic and a kind of a strategic element to it. I think on the economic inflation side, it's pretty clear that reducing tariffs there would have an impact on inflation, and it seems to have done a lot of more harm than good probably for the US in the long term. I think we can be serious about China and the threats it poses without necessarily relying on heavy-handed tariffs to get at that challenge. That said, I do appreciate, now that they're there's a lot of leverage, so I think using that in a smart way is also important. More broadly, to your point, we have seen, there has been a growth in, export restrictions as well as import restrictions over the last couple of years. And so certainly that is something that we would traditionally try to get at through a WTO process. There are essentially rules and disciplines around that. So we have the infrastructure to address it. I think it requires, we had a pretty good outcome at the WTO ministerial last month. It was not a blow up, and there was some outcomes which I think were quite positive. And so reinvigorating that process and using the rules that we have in the WTO to sort of really push back in a serious way on some of these export restrictions in particular, which are challenging, is I think the way to go at the moment. And then I think we need to reinvigorate our trade policy agenda. Frankly, we need to be a lot more, I think, proactive on that front, which we're clearly not at the moment. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework has sort of been launched. It's going to take a while to play out, and we'll see where that ends up. But that's not a free trade agreement as we traditionally understand it. And whether it gets at some of these issues is unclear. But I think the trade policy route is one policy lever which is probably being underused at the moment to get at some of these challenges.
Okay, there's a question right there.
Yes, thank you so much. My name is Guzin, and I'm a rising sophomore at UNC Chapel Hill, and right now I'm conducting immigration policy research at the New Lines Institute. I wanted to go back to the workforce kind of dilemma and how immigration plays into it. Most of the discussion here today was based around college students and their permanent residency, but I wanted to ask you about your thoughts of professionals that went to school in foreign countries and now are immigrating to the US. I'm a first-generation immigrant, and my parents used to be both doctors, and my mom is an infectious disease specialist, and she couldn't find a job during COVID. So it kind of in that realm, what do you suggest policy change should look like? And in a broader sense, H-1 visa is one of the very few visas that do grant permanent residency, but the H-2 and the H-3 visas only allow for immigrants to work for a certain amount of time, and then they have to go back. So do you think that policy reform in these areas would solve most of the labor issues that we have in the U.S.? Thank you.
I'm not an immigration expert, and you, it sounds like, probably know more about it than me, but I do think that, talent that's educated, bringing talent that's educated elsewhere here is an important piece of this puzzle. It's probably not the silver bullet solution or the only piece of the puzzle, but I think in addition to what Darren and I were speaking to earlier about foreign talent that we educate here in the United States and domestic-born talent, that's a really important piece that was left out of that conversation. So thanks for raising that.
Okay, right there's a question.
Yes, thank you very much. My name's Lafayette Barnes. I'm president of a company called SME, Zulu Global Enterprise, and a retiree, so I'm happy about that after many years in local government. But my question is actually two questions. One for Rachel, if you could drill down a little bit on the workforce development type of training, particularly in the STEM area. I mean, what does that mean in terms of folks who are involved in workforce development here in the district as it relates to training, residents for those particular opportunities? And then the second question is really for any of you. As this is a global supply chain issue, nobody said anything about Latin America or Africa. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about the implications of our trade relationships with China and other Asian countries and what impact that has, if any, on other parts of the country, of the globe, I should say. Thank you.
Great questions.
Just briefly on both, and then I'll defer to Josh, but to the kind of local role in STEM education, I think that's where it comes down to laying the groundwork at those primary and secondary levels, and that's something that I actually think we've made a lot of progress on in recent years. I think the challenges remaining are in those post-secondary and advanced degrees in terms of high-skill STEM talent. And then to the question particularly about Latin America, I think that does play into some of the conversations we've been having around kind of nearshoring and friendshoring. So there's the difference between onshoring, bringing things back to the United States, and bringing them back to, say, the Americas. There was a question in the previous panel about North America to include Mexico. But I think, looking at Latin America more broadly is a really important part of what we can produce in this hemisphere, if not in this country.
Yeah, I'm just picking up on the second question. I mean, I completely agree with you. I mean, Mexico clearly can play a very particular role given its integration already into North America. Though I wouldn't want to overstate that, I think. But, there is some specific industries, when one thinks about in terms of IT or medical equipment and devices and batteries and so forth, where you can easily imagine, a pretty critical role for Mexico. They've got a skilled workforce. There's obviously infrastructure links and so forth. And Latin America more broadly, I mean, the US has a number of free trade agreements with a number of countries in Latin America, and there's clearly opportunity there. There was actually we will recall the free trade agreement of the Americas during the early Bush years, I believe, which went nowhere. So there's been various visions over time of knitting the hemispheres, more closely together economically. One would hope that there's a pathway to doing that at some future point. I think the politics in South America generally are challenging at the moment. We've had elections in changes of government in Colombia, and there's a process to amend the constitution underway in Chile. I've got no comments about that, but what that means in terms of thinking about free trade and integration in supply chains, I think we have to see where that goes. But there seems to be real potential. I mean, there's skilled workforces. There's a lot of Spanish speaking is obviously not a language barrier in the United States as a general rule. We need to work on infrastructure. I think if we're going to get serious about supply chains in a more meaningful way across the hemispheres. When it comes to Africa, this is one area where the US, I think, has always underplayed and really needs to refocus. And I think there are efforts underway. There's been proposed FTAs and so forth, and AGOA has been helpful from a development perspective. But I think in getting serious about thinking about Africa as a genuine kind of major alternative manufacturing sector is not one where I think we've given enough attention. And now there is a continental free trade agreement there, which is going to really, I think, potentially stitch a lot of these countries together in a more meaningful way. So there's a lot of potential there. But again, I think we're going to get back to issues like infrastructure, governance, corruption, rule of law. But these are not necessarily intractable, but I do think it requires sort of a renewed focus on Africa as an alternative sort of supply chain and manufacturing destination.
Okay, there's a question right over there.
Thank you. Hi, Pedro Casas. I'm the Research and Policy Manager at the U.S.-Mexico Foundation, so you get a sense where my question is heading. I think we're missing two very pragmatic things to discuss on a wider and long-term perspective, which is, first of all, the current U.S. market doesn't have the labor capacity to fill all the job openings there are, right? So there's not enough people to cover all the things that can be done. And secondly, the U.S. population is aging. In a few years' time, the social security system is not going to be able to uphold with given the demographics that we have. And when you look at Mexico, your closest neighbor, your closest ally, you can find pretty much all the solutions there. You have complementary workforce, you have younger workforce, and nonetheless, when we were asked about North America and when we're asked about Mexico, the topic's kind of not even in the table. The Mexican president was here yesterday with a whole delegation of business people, including Carlos Slim. He used to be the richest man on earth for several years, and it didn't make it to any headline of any newspaper in America. You know, we covered that the production of Peloton bicycles and we found like 1,000 puppies, but the Mexican president was completely irrelevant. So anyway, my question is, why aren't we discussing about Mexico when, to my point of view, it's a low-hanging fruit for, building a stronger, more resilient supply chain here in America and in the continent? Thanks.
Thank you for that question. Our panelists.
Yeah, I mean, so part of my work stream here is on North America and USMCA. So I'm very sympathetic to your points, and I'm not going to comment on what the media does or doesn't cover in any particular day. But I do think there's a couple of things going on there. One is that the US does take its relationship and economic relationship with America and Canada, and with Mexico and Canada, I think, for granted. And so there is that, and it's a relationship with its ups and downs, but which fundamentally works. And the US is the gorilla in that relationship, and so there's a sense of this can drift, and I think that's a problem, because we saw this perspective over time with NAFTA, and we saw that ultimately this was one of the reasons that we ran into so much trouble, I think, during the Trump administration. And we have a new agreement in place now, which is different, and I think it's important. It got high levels of bipartisan support in the Congress, so it's a new opportunity to rethink how do we take advantage of our relationship with Mexico. And when one thinks about the issues we've been talking about today, resilient supply chains, secure supply chains, the types of manufacturing we want to bring back, we must think about this from a North American perspective, not just a US perspective. It would be a critical mistake not to, we would lose resilience, we would lose competitiveness, we would lose opportunities to strengthen our relationships with our two closest partners if we don't think about this through a North American lens and not just a US lens. So, I think that's fundamentally important. And, irrespective of what wasn't reported on yesterday, there is fortunately quite a bit going on, thinking about where Mexico can play a role. And I take your point about it's an educated workforce. There are skills there. There are clearly opportunities to expand the production, and whether it's in IT or medical products, to do more there. So I'm hoping that's what we're going to see going forward, because I think from an economic and strategic perspective, it's clearly the win for everyone.
Okay, I'm going to close with a question from one of our online viewers, and this concerns the transition to a clean energy economy. And of course, this gets into kind of solar panels, electric cars, batteries, and many of these things actually are coming from abroad now. So the supply chain part of this is, to what extent are these supply chain limitations going to constrain this transition to a clean energy economy?
Yeah, so potentially, I think the administration is looking at this, right? They have been focused on some of these issues already, and so whether it's on batteries or on the various inputs into clean energy, we've already seen, through various executive orders and so forth, that there is a close look at this component of it. So it's absolutely true. I mean, if you think about, various batteries, they're going to be built out into electric vehicles or for energy storage, the critical minerals that go into making sure that these work. Nickel, if you take nickel, for instance, the price of nickel has gone up, some amount, as a result of the war in Russia, right? So we see that, you know, these things, these inputs, which can really be disruptive, get critically disrupted through these large events. So it's a challenge, but I think there is an attempt to think carefully about what we can do here in North America with allies to ensure, I think most importantly, that we have other sources of supply. So that we are not sort of constrained and relying on particular countries or one or two suppliers. I think that's really the key thing is when we think about resiliency, it's really got to be thought about from a distributed capacity perspective, and that's got to be both at a firm level but also geographically as well.
Okay, Josh, Rachel, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us, our in-house audience and our virtual audience. Thank you very much for your interest. Thank you for tuning in.